It's good to see everyone, and thank you for those who are joining us. We actually do have some people that watch online, whether it's live or after the fact. But welcome to our Truth Seekers that meets the first and third Tuesday of every month, and we also have a prayer time the second Tuesday of every month. I believe this is more important than ever to really talk about what's going on in the world, how the church can be dealing with those issues and engaging in those issues. So obviously we know that last week was an election, and when it comes to talking about politics and government, there's lots of debate, if you will, within the church world of how much the church should get involved, right? And we've been talking about kind of establishing a foundation that clearly there were Christian roots to our country and how it was founded. And there's been the excuse of Romans chapter 13, where some people will take that to the extreme and say, well, that just means you just obey whatever they say. And then there's the excuse that the founders weren't really Christian. They were just deists and things like that. We talked about that last week, how no, most of them were probably what we would still consider Christians, had some different views, but they clearly were taking Judeo-Christian principles. Well, today we'll talk about a phrase that has become, just very familiar: separation of church and state. In fact, sadly, I think if you ask most people where that phrase comes from, if they know what the Constitution is, they would probably say the Constitution. Now, many people probably don't really know what a constitution is today, but it isn't in the Constitution. It's actually referring to the Constitution. And so, you hear that phrase, separation of church and state, and it kind of makes it sound like, the church and the state, they should be separate. They shouldn't have any interaction. So it kind of justifies when the state, the government, says, oh, you can't have any kind of a church service in the lawn of the courthouse, right? Or that you can't have a Christmas nativity scene at the courthouse, or you can't pray at school. In fact, just recently in this last Supreme Court session, a guy lost his job because he was praying by himself after football games, and they fired him from that, took it all the way to the Supreme Court. Thankfully, the Supreme Court said, no, he has every right to do that. But a misunderstanding of the idea of separation of church and state is what leads that to go all the way up to the Supreme Court. Right? And so I want to look a little bit at that. And to understand separation of church and state, you kind of have to understand where the founders are coming from. What's their background? So, their parents and their grandparents, what would they be thinking about? And so you go all the way back, you find kind of a brief history of the West and how it was formed with Christianity. You had Jesus dies and rises again. You have the spread of the church slowly but surely. Lots of persecution in the first century AD. Still quite a bit of persecution in the second century AD, but now it's all throughout the Roman Empire, which was the empire of the day. And so it continued to grow. In the 300s, Emperor Constantine made it legal to be a Christian. That's what he did at first. He just made it legal, where you no longer were they persecuted as much because it was legal. It would actually be later that it would be made the official religion of Rome. Well, that started all kinds of mess. So the church becomes very powerful, and it is involved in government. Many times there's not much difference between the church and the state. And then there's conflict between the church and the state, and who is more powerful? Is the Pope more powerful, or is the emperor more powerful? Is the Pope more powerful? And then as kind of states or nations started to develop, you'd have, well, is the King of France, is he more powerful than the Pope, or does he submit to the Pope? You had all of this conflict. And then to make it even more fun, you had Martin Luther and the Reformation. So you had what we would consider the Catholic Church today. That was it. That was the church. Then you had the Reformation. So you start to have splintering. Well, the Catholic Church, they did not like the Reformation. So they were trying to kind of get rid of it. But then they also had a lot of problems coming from this new religion from Islam. And so they kind of couldn't fight both at the same time. So they decided to give the Protestants, okay, we'll make a deal with you. You just go your own way. We'll go our own way. Well, then all of these different nations started to decide, well, are we going to be Catholic or are we going to be Protestant? And then within Protestant, you had all kinds of divisions. And I'm saying that to lead all the way up to the point in the 1500s in England, the debate came to them with under the perfect leader to handle such a tumultuous time, King Henry VIII. You know, just he's the one that he dubbed himself Defender of the Faith, I think, and just horrible guy, right? And so he started off being Catholic, very pro-Catholic, and actually would persecute heretics. So he would persecute Protestants and things like that. He actually had William Tyndale, who was one of the first to really translate the Bible from Greek and Hebrew into English, where people could actually read it. Mind you, this whole time, no one was reading the Bible. They were being told what the Bible says by the elite, right? And Martin Luther didn't like that, but he didn't even go as far as what the true Protestant, would happen, especially whenever you started having crazy Baptists and stuff like that start to be formed, And what was kind of interesting is King Henry had Tyndale killed. He was actually put on the stake, strangled, and then burned. So, just to make sure, because he was a heretic and he had the Bible translated into English where everyone could read. That was a threat, obviously, to the popes, to the system. And so then, King Henry, he decided he wanted to be divorced. The Catholic Church wouldn't let him be divorced. So all of a sudden he had this unbelievable encounter with God, and he decided he was going to be Protestant, right? And what was funny through all of this is then, in order to be Protestant, he was like, you know what? We need that Bible that we can read so we don't have to listen to the Pope. So then he actually adopts the Bible that Tyndale wrote and makes it the Bible of England. You can't make this stuff up, right? And so then you have the Church of England that is formed, and I guess we'd consider it an Anglican church today, but it was the Church of England. It was the state. If you lived in England, you were a member of the Anglican Church, the Church of England, and your taxes and money went to support that church. Whether you cared or not, you were supporting that church. So you have these different groups that are like, this is not good. They actually start reading the Bible. Shock of shocks. And so you have two different groups. You have the Puritans, who wanted to purify the church, right? They wanted to, they saw all of the egregious things that the church was doing, so they wanted to purify it from within. And then that kind of went nowhere, and they didn't really make any headway, because the king, if you're the head of the church and the state and it's all one and you're the king, are you going to do what's best for the faith, or are you going to do what's best for you? You're going to do what's best for you. So then there were groups called the Separatists, and what they wanted to do is separate from the Anglican Church. And that there were multiple groups that did that. One of the ones that we know of, obviously, are the Pilgrims. So they ended up going to Holland for a while, and then they came across and kind of started, the foundations of America. Along with there were other colonies. We know there was Jamestown, but they're in Plymouth. So you have that as a backdrop. So that's what they understood the relationship to church and state to be. Kind of a mess, right? And what was interesting is even the Puritans, they came over here for religious freedom, right? But then as they kind of got established, they started making similar laws that if you were going to live within their group, you had to be Puritan, the way that they were Puritan. Right? So all of this is happening for the few hundred years leading up to the founding of our country. And so whenever the founders are talking about religion, they are talking about Christianity and Christianity only, because that's what they were used to, right? That now there were different types and different sects and things like that. But whenever they use the word religion, it's talking about a Christian religion. And they wanted to do something very different. They saw the danger of the church and the state being enmeshed. So we know that one of the clauses in the First Amendment was that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, with all of that background that we've just talked about, it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? No law respecting the establishment of religion. They didn't want somebody to say, it's the Anglican Church, and you have to pay taxes to it, you have to support it, and you have to be part of it, right? So they didn't want the government to say that there's one denomination, we would call it today, denomination or religion, that is going to be established by the government. There needs to be a separation there, right? And it said also the prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So that you could worship the way that you wanted to. And this did extend to other religions, right? Now, they pretty much in their writings deal only with Christianity, but they would agree that, you have a right to be Buddhist. You have a right to worship Allah, right? That you can do that. But the state is not going to establish any kind of religion. And not only, it's frustrating that we don't understand this, and this is a good spiritual battle tactic to get people not to understand it. Not only did the founders never envision a time when Christianity wouldn't be an influence, they couldn't imagine that it would be separated out from the public discourse. Right? So you have things like George Washington saying, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. He's basically saying you can't be a good patriot if you do not support religion and morality, right? That's a pretty strong tie to the importance of faith and our country. Not really a separation of church and state, if you will. John Witherspoon, also one of the founding fathers, says, he is the best friend to American liberty who is the most sincere and active in promoting true and undefiled religion, and who sets himself with the greatest firmness to bear down profanity and immorality of every kind. Whoever is an avowed enemy of God, I scruple or hesitate. We need to bring that word back, right? I scruple or I hesitate not at all, not to call him an enemy of his country, right? So, that's a pretty powerful, the promoting true and undefiled religion is one of the most important things to American liberty. And for someone who doesn't do that, he considers an enemy to the country, right? If you don't recognize that. So that brings us to the phrase separation of church and state. It is actually, Thomas Jefferson is writing a letter in response to the Danbury Baptist group. So the states are now starting to kind of form. And what this Danbury Baptist group, they were worried about, because they actually were persecuted. Baptists were persecuted in a lot of the places. The Puritans didn't like the Baptists from the beginning. And they were just extremely concerned that, hey, all of this is going to go back to like it was in England. You say all of these good things and stuff like this. What's to keep it from happening? And so Thomas Jefferson writes back, assuring them that, hey, we're putting this as part of the First Amendment to keep this from happening. So he writes, he said, I contemplate with sovereign reverence the act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So obviously quoting from the First Amendment, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. And so what he is talking about in reference to that is that the church is not going to tell you that you can't do something, right? The church, there's going to be a separation there. He would have never imagined that people would have interpreted that as, oh, well, that means the church can't have anything to do or speak into the state. In fact, and it's funny because that's how many groups interpret that now. In fact, that's what they say. They say the government has to be secular. They can't have anything to do, any connection, right? That I don't think would have crossed Thomas Jefferson's mind since 2 days. He wrote that letter on January 1st. On January 3rd, it was a Sunday, and he went to church as he did all the time, and the church was held in the United States Capitol each week. So I don't think he intended it to be that that you can't have religious things as part of the state, or the state can't support religious things. It's just that the state cannot infringe and cannot establish a state church, and that the state doesn't have any business in religion. So Thomas Jefferson, a couple more things that he wrote. This was not in the letter, but other things that he says, no nation has ever yet existed or been governed without religion, nor can be. The Christian religion is the best religion that has been given to man, and I, as chief magistrate of this nation, am bound to give it the sanction of my example. Now, Thomas Jefferson is one that, a lot of Christians like to say, oh, this guy wasn't a real Christian, right? We, kind of making up all these excuses. Now, we don't know fully, but that's a pretty strong statement, right? That not only is that government, that a country cannot exist without religion, that Christianity is the best religion ever, and that he is going to actually follow it and practice it as an example to the people. So these were really interesting to me. So this is from Joseph Story, and he was one of the most well-known Supreme Court justices. He was actually the founder of Harvard. This would have been back in 1833. His father, I believe, was one of the guys at the Boston Tea Party. All right. So I mean, we're talking, this isn't like a Supreme Court justice recently writing this. He wrote it within, 15 years or so, 15, 20 years of the Constitution actually being put together. And he said, at the time of adoption of the Constitution and of the amendment to it now under consideration, the First Amendment, the general, if not universal sentiment in America was that Christianity ought to receive encouragement from the state, so far as such encouragement was not incompatible with the private rights of conscience and the freedom of religious worship. Right? So he's actually saying they understood that Christianity is kind of the de facto religion of the nation, but it wouldn't keep someone from worshiping something else or in a different way. And then he says, an attempt to level all religions and to make it a matter of state policy to hold all in utter indifference. So basically to say we don't have anything to do with any religion, anything like that, would have created universal disapprobation or disapproval, if not universal indignation, which is anger. Right? So at that time in 1833, it would have been inconceivable for the government to not allow a church to worship in the Capitol or anything like that. That's a misunderstanding of separation of church and state that we have applied today that was never intended. He also says this. He says, the promulgation of the great doctrines of religion The being, the attributes, and the providence of one Almighty God, the responsibility to Him for all our actions founded upon moral accountability, a future state of rewards and punishments, the cultivation of all the personal, social, and benevolent virtues, these never can be a matter of indifference in any well-ordered community. It is indeed difficult to conceive how any civilized society can well exist without them. This is from a Supreme Court judge, right? One that has actually written kind of the first book on American jurisprudence that is still used today. There was also the Northwest Ordinance was kind of set up for 5 states to be come into being, and this was kind of written as they were getting started. It was written the same year that the Constitution was written, and Article 3 of that ordinance said, "Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and means of education shall forever be encouraged." So it was encouraging. It said this needs to be taught in our schools. So that was the founding of these 5 states that were beginning to be created. And so the next, we only have 2 more slides left, and these kind of give a good example of what the founders, when they're talking about religion, what they meant by that, right? They were not affirming a Baptist polity or a Puritan or a Presbyterian. They were talking more in a general level of what is religion. And Benjamin Franklin wrote this right at the end of his life. This is a letter to a pastor. Again, Benjamin Franklin is one who people will say didn't have many beliefs, but you read his writing. I don't know about salvation, but he certainly knew more about the Bible than most Christians do today. I will say that, and was very favorable to it. But he writes this. He says, "Here is my creed. I believe in one God, the creator of the universe, that He governs it by His providence, that He ought to be worshiped, that the most acceptable service we render to Him is in doing good to His other children, that the soul of man is immortal and will be treated with justice in another life, respecting its conduct in this. These I take to be the fundamental points." Excuse me, I have to go to this one. The fundamental points that the soul of man is immortal and will become treated with justice in another life, respecting its conduct in this. These I take to be the fundamental points in all sound religion. So in all sound religion. So he's kind of summed that up. And if you look at all of the founders' writings, those 5 points come through. It says that there is a creator who made all things, and humanity should recognize and worship Him. Right? So they understood that was the foundation of this country, that was true. A second is that the Creator has received a moral code of behavior to happy living, which distinguishes right from wrong. Right? That was an important understanding. They believed there was right and wrong, which is why you needed a government. Right? If there wasn't right or wrong, you could just let people do whatever they wanted. No, they knew that there was right and wrong. The Creator holds humanity responsible for the way they treat each other. And then combine that with the fourth, that strangely you saw a lot, is that all humanity live beyond this life. And then the fifth kind of point about religion was that humanity will be judged for their conduct in this life. Right? That's interesting that they talked about that quite a bit. Because they recognized how that impacts government, right? If there's nothing else to this life, then you just pursue as much power, fame, and fortune as you can, right? Because there's no consequences. Well, they saw what could happen when a government does that, and so they recognized, no, there's something bigger out there. Did they force everyone to follow a specific Christian doctrine? No, they didn't. But they clearly held Christian beliefs. And in fact, it was necessary for the foundation of our government. And the reason that we are kind of engaging in this ministry to talk about this specifically is because the only way that our country was started and survived was because people kind of held those 5 things in common, right? And if you start taking those away, our system of government is not equipped to handle that. That's why we see more and more chaos. That's why we see more an elevation of government, of giving more power to government. The founders would be shocked today if they saw how powerful our government would be. In fact, they would be having another Boston Tea Party, right? Because they would recognize, no, this is getting out of hand. The good thing is it's not too late. This is within our founding, and this is why it's not political answers that we're looking for. We're looking for spiritual answers of people to be going back to understanding who God is, His role in the founding of this country. Yes, that interplays with the political system, but if you're just going to sit back and I tell pastors and Christians out there, if you think that you can just, sit and go to Sunday school and church and worship and then just vote when it comes up and that's your only interaction with what's going on, we will lose what we have. We have to engage and be more proactive in teaching these foundational principles, which I believe are part of the gospel message. Right? I was reading somewhere, someone said, and it was talking about why it's important to get involved and understand what's going on in the government, is that as the church, the most important thing we can do is preach the gospel, the full gospel message, right? And so the second most important thing you can do is making sure you're fighting for the right to preach that message unhindered, right? And our country has always been that way. But that's not the norm. We want to keep it that way, which means we need to be engaging in our country and fighting for liberty and standing up for that, because that is the foundation of who we are. And so whenever you hear that phrase, separation of church and state, don't let anyone try to convince you that that means that the church can't get involved with the government. It's not that at all. In fact, the founders wanted to make sure that religion was vital to the everyday life of Americans and the future of this country. All right, thank you for joining us. We'll be back the first Tuesday in December.